Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are diving back into a truly compelling source today, one that offers an incredibly detailed account of historical military events, specifically focusing on the North-Eastern Sahel Front.
That's exactly right. And this is part two of our exploration into this specific document. We're picking up the narrative pretty much right where we left off in our previous deep dive.
So yeah, if you haven't listened to part one yet, I really do encourage you to go back and do that first. It gives you all the essential context. It sets the stage for the events we'll be discussing today, gives you the full picture leading into this next phase of the conflict, at least as described by our source.
Definitely. So for this deep dive, our mission is, again, to continue extracting the most important insights and, well, knowledge nuggets from this specific source material. It gives a very detailed account of these subsequent military offensives and some really key strategic developments in this particular theater of conflict during the historical period.
And it really doesn't shy away from the specifics, does it?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, what makes it so valuable for analysis. We're going to be looking at troop movements, defensive preparations, detailed descriptions of attacks, and the outcomes of some truly significant engagements, all seen through the lens of this one particular document.
And just to quickly recap where we ended part one, based on this source, the EPLF had already faced the initial waves of what the source calls enemy offensives and, according to this account, had successfully weathered them.
Right.
So at the close of that period, they were described as being in a state of readiness, basically anticipating further conflict. And that preparedness is precisely where this part of the story kicks off, according to our source.
Okay, great. Let's jump right into that sense of anticipation and adaptation that our source describes, leading into what it actually terms the third offensive. How did the EPLF prepare for this next phase?
Well, according to the source, following the enemy's previous actions, what it calls the second offensive, the EPLF was clearly expecting another major push. Their response, as it's documented here, involved some pretty extensive preparation, specifically the construction of trenches.
And the source actually pinpoints where these defensive works were built, doesn't it?
It does, yes. It mentions trenches were dug in two main geographical areas, really, in anticipation of this third offensive. One key area was the Eastern Plains, specifically at locations named Mahmad and Azhara.
Mahmad and Azora. Okay. And the other area was along a major route.
That's right. The source also notes the construction of trenches at Genfalom that's located along the Karen Alphabet route. These positions were apparently established because, according to this account, the third offensive was indeed launched through these two, let's say, general strategic directions, the Eastern Plains and that Karen Alphabet route.
So it sounds like they correctly anticipated the general axis of advance. But before the offensive fully kicked off, the source describes a pretty significant tactical adjustment by the EPLF, particularly concerning that Genfalem position.
Yeah, this is a really interesting detail about their strategic thinking, as it's presented in the source anyway. It indicates that the EPLF leadership recognized a vulnerability at that Genfalem front. The source uses the phrase stretched too much to describe the defensive line there.
Stretched too much.
Yeah.
Maybe too thin or too exposed, perhaps?
That's the implication, yeah. Perhaps overextended given the resources they had, or maybe considering the potential strength of the enemy push they were expecting in that sector. So with this realization, just before the third offensive was actually launched, the source states that some EPLF units carried out a strategic withdrawal from the Genfalem area itself.
Right, a deliberate pullback before the enemy arrived in full force. Smart. And where did this withdrawal lead them? Where did they go?
The source tells us these units moved to a location called Goge. And when they got there, they didn't just, regroup. They immediately took up new positions and established what the source calls a new defensive line.
Okay, a new line at Goge. Can you describe the span of this new line, according to the source?
Yeah, this new defensive line, as it's detailed in the document, stretched from Mount Agombosa all the way across to the hilly areas known as Agamet. So they moved from that specific point along the Karen Alphabet route to a new line, presumably a stronger or maybe just better positioned line in a different area.
And what was the stated consequence or maybe the success of this particular maneuver, this withdrawal and repositioning?
Well, the source explicitly credits this specific strategic move with blocking a significant enemy action. It states this withdrawal to Goge and the establishment of the new line blocked the enemy's infiltration attempt of the 1979. So it suggests that the anticipated enemy move in that sector was basically thwarted precisely because the EPLF wasn't where the enemy perhaps expected them to be, but instead in a position better suited for defense.
Okay, so the EPLF adapted their position at Genfalone along that Karen alphabet axis. But the enemy, as described by the source, also employed tactics beyond just, direct frontal assaults on the expected lines.
Oh, absolutely. The source details what certainly appears to be a deliberate attempt by the enemy to divert the EPLF's attention. And this action is placed specifically on January 25, 1979.
How did they try to create this diversion? What did they do?
Well, it involved a pretty significant movement of forces. The enemy mobilized what the source describes as their strongest army division, which is referred to as 505, or sometimes Gibrahale. This powerful unit was moved from Massawa all the way to Marsa Tekle, which is a coastal location.
Oh.
And simultaneously, mechanized units were dispatched to Mamiet, another area in the North-Eastern Sahel region.
And the intent behind this big movement, according to the source, what were they trying to achieve?
The source is quite clear on the perceived purpose anyway. It states this was done in a way that seems to launch an attack on Mamoride Front. Now, Mamide was one of those key trench locations on the Eastern Plains we mentioned earlier.
Right.
So the enemy was trying to make it look like their main thrust would be aimed right at Mamide, hoping to draw the EPLF's focus there.
Creating a strategic misdirection, basically. But our source indicates the EPLF leadership wasn't entirely fooled by a potential move coming from that coastal direction.
This is another point the source really highlights as, well, demonstrating the EPLF's foresight. It emphasizes that the EPLF's leadership had already anticipated the possibility that the enemy might try to approach via the Red Sea coastline. They weren't blind to a potential seaborne or, coastal flanking maneuver.
And this anticipation led to specific preparations in that area.
Yes, exactly. Because they had foreseen this possibility, the source states they had already assigned 2 battalions specifically to the areas around Mamamet and Marsa Tikle, the very areas the enemy's strongest division was just moved to. These battalions were positioned there, quote, to prepare themselves for any eventuality originating from that coastal region.
So, the enemy's big diversionary maneuver from the coast actually encountered pre-existing EPLF preparedness in those specific areas. Interesting. So, what happened when the enemy forces actually began their advance towards the northeastern Sahel?
Well, as the enemy forces did indeed move towards the northeastern Sahel area, the EPLF units that were positioned back at Mamide, one of the original trench lines, initiated let's call it a retraction. A large portion of the EPLF units there withdrew from Mamide itself.
And they pulled back to Gorihedo and Wedgen. Is that what the source says?
That's correct, according to the source. They withdrew to Gorihedo and Wedgen, although it does note they left 2 battalions behind, specifically in a place called Ajet. Now, this withdrawal, which was prompted by the enemy's advance on that coastal flank, had a critical and immediate consequence, according to the source.
So what was that consequence? What happened?
The source really stresses that this enemy advance directly endangered a number of critical areas located nearby. These weren't primary fighting positions, more like essential support zones.
Ah, the haven areas you mentioned earlier, the rear areas.
Yes, exactly. The source lists them: Debat, Zero, Seberkat, Bleket, Fa, and Mamimet itself. And the document points out that these areas harbored people as well as essential goods and equipment of the EPLF. So the enemy's successful advance towards the northeastern Sahel put all of these vital resources and personnel under immediate threat of attack.
Wow, so a very urgent situation then, demanding swift action beyond just, military defense.
Absolutely. The source highlights the critical need for swift action to transport people and goods before it is too late. The EPLF basically had to rapidly move everything out of those threatened haven areas to prevent them from being captured or destroyed by the advancing enemy.
Okay, so while this urgent evacuation was underway, how did the enemy forces react to the EPLF's withdrawal from Mamamide and you said, limited EPLF presence in those coastal areas?
Well, the source states that the enemy took the advantage of a very limited number of EPLF combatants who were in Mamimet and Marsa Tikle. Seeing that only those 2 preparatory battalions were there, and the main forces had pulled back from Mamamide, the enemy forces marched onwards. Specifically, they headed towards Gorito and Wedgen, which is where many of the EPLF units from Mamide had just relocated.
So essentially pursuing the withdrawing EPLF forces and pushing the threat deeper into the area closer to those evacuation points.
Precisely. And this created a direct confrontation point right there at Goriteto and Wedgen. The source explains that this basically forced the EPLF's hand. They had to launch an attack to prevent the areas from being attacked by the enemy. They couldn't just keep withdrawing. They had to fight to protect the ongoing evacuation and their newly repositioned forces.
Makes sense. And when did this necessary counteraction take place? Does the source give a date?
This engagement, according to the source, occurred in the first week of February 1979.
Okay. And what was the outcome of this EPLF attack? The one meant to protect Gori Tato and Wedgen and the evacuation.
Well, the EPLF forces engaged the advancing enemy, and the source states they pushed the enemy to the plains. This indicates they not only halted the enemy advance, but actually managed to drive them back geographically.
And the strategic benefit of this counterpush, what did that achieve?
Crucially, the source connects this military outcome directly to the logistical challenge they were facing. It explains that pushing the enemy back to the plains paved a way for safe transportation of people and goods from those threatened areas, Debat, Zero, and the others.
Ah, got it. So the military actions served the vital purpose of securing the rear and allowing that critical evacuation to be completed safely. Where were these people and goods moved to, did the source say?
Yes, the source lists the safer destinations they were transported to as Gerger Asmara, Kerberwet, Halibet, and Agreg. So yeah, the tactical counterattack was absolutely integral to the success of this critical logistical operation, according to this account.
Right. And what was the key development after this successful evacuation and relocation, which was facilitated by that counterattack? What happened next?
Well, following the successful movement of people and essential resources, the EPLF consolidated their control and positions in that area. And according to the source, this is the point where the North-Eastern Sahel Front, often abbreviated as NSF, was formally established. It became a distinct, recognized front in the conflict.
So this marks the formal creation of a new major front then. Where did this front span geographically, according to the source?
The source provides quite specific details about the physical location and extent of this newly formed front. It states that the EPLF took up positions stretching for approximately 40 kilometers. This line ran from Wedgen, one of the places they had recently withdrawn to, all the way to Tabasalam.
And did it encompass other specific points along that 40-kilometer stretch?
Yes, the source lists several intermediate points that kind of define the line. It ran through Desnet, Hatzinet, and Debris Yemen, and thereby to Tigi, and that ends in Alalib. So that chain of geographical markers basically delineates the approximate 40-kilometer length of the North-Eastern Sahel Front when it was first established.
And what was the strategic significance of establishing the NSF at this particular point? What did it represent?
Well, within the narrative presented by the source, it really signifies the EPLF's successful adaptation to the enemy's coastal approach. Instead of, abandoning the area or being routed, they conducted these tactical withdrawals, secured their vital assets through that counterattack and evacuation, and then established a new fixed line of defense. It represented them consolidating their hold on this coastal sector and creating a permanent point of confrontation there.
And the source gives us a sense of how vast this front eventually became over time.
It does, yeah. It highlights the scale of the conflict as it evolved. EPLF documents, which are referenced in the source, indicate that as the war progressed with ongoing battles and successive enemy offensives, the North-Eastern Sahel Front was by far stretched.
Stretched how? Did it connect with other defensive lines?
Yes. The source states it eventually became interconnected with the trench systems around Nakfa, which is a place we'll definitely talk more about shortly. This merging created this, immense defensive network.
And the total length of this vast interconnected front, what does the source say?
The source puts the total covered area of this combined stretched front at 667 kilometers.
Wow.
Just think about that number for a second. 667 kilometers of defensive lines. That gives you a really tangible sense of the immense scale of the fortifications and the geographical extent of the conflict in this region, at least as it's presented in this document.
667 kilometers. That's truly staggering to picture the human effort and strategic planning that would go into defending a line of that length. Okay, so we have the formation of the massive North-Eastern Sahel Front, resulting from the EPLF's response to the enemy's coastal maneuvers during this period of the Third Offensive. But the source also connects these developments to concurrent movements happening on the other major axis of the expected Third Offensive, right?
Yes, absolutely. The source links the events in the North-Eastern Sahel with movements happening pretty much simultaneously along the Karen Alphabet route. That was the other direction where the Third Offensive was anticipated to hit hard.
The area where they had initially withdrawn from Genfelem to Goge.
Exactly. So the source describes a further withdrawal from the Karen Alphabet route itself. Following their earlier move to Goge, the EPLF, according to this account, withdrew even further from that route.
And in doing so, they left Alphabet City behind. Is that mentioned?
Yes, the source specifically notes that they moved from Koke, leaving Alphabet City behind them. Their path then led them to the Haide River, and there they fortified a position specifically located in the mountains known as Haras Harmaz.
Okay, so another tactical withdrawal, establishing a fortified position at Haras Harmaz by the Haide River. Was this their final position in that sector, according to the source?
Not quite. The source indicates that after engaging the enemy there and making them face, quote, heavy losses at Haras Harmaz, the EPLF units undertook one final withdrawal in that area.
And this final pullback led them to an incredibly significant location.
It did. It led them to Mount Denden. And the source uses some pretty striking language to describe Mount Denden's position, calling it situated at the very gates of Nakfa.
Right on the doorstep of that crucial city, Nakfa.
Precisely. And it was there, on Mount Denden and along the associated chain of terrains, that the EPLF established what the source explicitly identifies as their final defense line in this sector.
And why was Nakfa so critical, according to this document? What's its significance?
Well, the source underscores Nakfa's importance by calling it the only uncaptured city. This single phrase, as it's presented in this document, really highlights its immense symbolic weight and strategic value in the context of this conflict. Holding Nakfa appears to have been absolutely paramount for the EPLF, according to this specific account.
So with the EPLF consolidating their final defense line right outside Nakfa, what was the enemy's immediate reaction? What did they do?
Well, the enemy forces, seeing the EPLF positioned right at Nakfa's entrance, immediately began exerting intense pressure on the city. The source describes this pressure taking the form of disturbing the city with aerial bombardments and heavy artillery.
So relentless shelling and bombing of the city itself and presumably the surrounding defense lines.
Yes, just a constant barrage. And this ceaseless bombardment, according to the source, created a significant challenge for the EPLF, even though they had chosen strong, mountainous terrain around Nakfa for their defense.
What was the specific difficulty the EPLF faced because of this bombardment?
The source states that the EPLF was not at ease to strengthen the last stronghold chosen to be in Nakfa terrains due to ceaseless bombardments. Basically, trying to build, reinforce, and improve their defenses under constant enemy fire was extremely difficult and really disrupted their ability to fully fortify that critical final line.
So facing this relentless pressure and the difficulty in building up their stronghold, how did the EPLF choose to respond? I mean, they couldn't just sit there and be shelled indefinitely, right?
Yeah, exactly. The source explains that the EPLF determined they needed to take proactive offensive action. They found it necessary, as the source puts it, to launch a strong counterattack to alleviate the pressure and protect their position.
And the date provided for this crucial counterattack at the gates of Nakfa.
According to this document, the strong counterattack was launched on February 13, 1979.
Okay, who were they targeting specifically with this attack?
They directed this attack against enemy forces who, according to the source, were marching in a hurry, desperate to recapture Nakfa. So it wasn't just a general engagement. It sounds like it was a targeted response to a specific, rapid enemy push aiming to finally take the city.
Makes sense. What was the outcome of this decisive counterattack on February 13th, as presented in the source?
The result, according to the source, was pretty significant. The EPLF engaged the enemy forces and, through this attack, outrouted the enemy forces and subsequently pushed them down to Haide River.
Pushed them back all the way to the Haide River. That's quite a distance back from the gates of Nakfa, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And the source highlights the dual benefit this outcome provided to the EPLF. First, it inflicted heavy costs on the enemy. They suffered huge losses. Second, and critically, by pushing the enemy back and creating that space, the EPLF found the opportunity to establish its defense fortification.
Ah, the very thing they were struggling to do under the ceaseless bombardments earlier.
Exactly. The source makes it clear that this counterattack provided the crucial breathing room and security needed to actually build and solidify their stronghold at the Nakfa front. The explicit purpose stated is so that enemy would never attempt to recapture Nakfa. It allowed them to establish a defense that, according to the source, was intended to be permanent and impregnable.
And this fortified position established at the Nakfa front after that successful counterattack.
According to the source, yes, it became a permanent stronghold. They established a permanent, fortified presence there.
Okay, let's just quickly connect back to something we touched on earlier. The source seemed to imply a strategic link between the newly formed North-Eastern Sahel Front and the situation unfolding back at Nakfa. Can you elaborate on that connection as the source presents it?
Yes, the source does mention again that the establishment of that North-Eastern Sahel Front wasn't just about holding territory in that specific coastal area in isolation. It had a broader strategic aim. It states this aim was partly to weaken the enemy forces through ambushes in the coastal region, to rout them out from the strategic areas of the coastline, and crucially, to deny supply lines that might run along the coast.
And how would disrupting the enemy along that long coastal NSF line potentially impact other areas like Nakfa? What's the inferred connection?
Well, the implication, as you draw it from the source, is that by creating constant pressure, denying movement, and disrupting logistics in the NSF area, it would necessarily weaken the enemy forces overall. It would draw their resources, their attention, their supply needs to that front.
Right.
And this, in turn, would presumably reduce the intensity of the pressure they could apply elsewhere, including against the absolutely critical Nakfa front. It suggests a kind of coordinated strategic understanding where different fronts were intended to support each other.
Fascinating how the source presents these seemingly separate actions as part of a larger strategic picture. Okay, we've covered the tactical movements, the formation of the extensive North-Eastern Sahel Front, and the critical defense and counterattack that secured the gates of Nakfa in early 1979. This seems to wrap up what the source describes as the third offensive period. But the conflict, according to this document, was clearly far from over. The source moves on to describe further intense engagements, including what it calls the fourth offensive. First, though, it gives us a bit of a broader perspective on the persistent nature of the conflict during this time.
It does. The source describes the conflict as the sustained struggle that had been ongoing for about 9 years by this point. And during this long period, the EPLF was depicted as constantly confronting the enemy in places and times of convenience.
So, choosing when and where to engage, being selective.
Yes, strategically picking their battles, it seems. But also, importantly, the source notes that alongside confronting the enemy, the EPLF was simultaneously solidifying its position. So they weren't just reacting, they were actively reinforcing and strengthening their hold on territory they controlled.
And part of that proactive approach involved offensive actions, too, not just defense.
Oh, absolutely. The source adds that the EPLF was also engaged in conducting surprise attacks against the enemy in different places. Now, this wasn't necessarily aimed at taking and holding large areas, but it had a specific purpose, according to the source, in a bid to weaken it so that it would never be strong to conduct huge offensives. This really highlights a strategy focused on attrition and disrupting the enemy's ability to launch those large-scale attacks.
And how is the enemy responding to this prolonged conflict in the EPLF's tactics during this broader period? They weren't just sitting back, presumably.
No, the source states that, likewise, the enemy forces were making rearrangements in their tactics. They weren't static either. They were constantly adapting their approaches and were constantly moving here and there in order to gain a ground of conducting an offense. They were actively searching for weak points and opportunities to launch new attacks themselves.
Okay. We heard earlier about the enemy's strongest unit, that 505 military division, being moved to the coastal area during the third offensive period. Where were they located according to the source in this subsequent period, leading up to the fourth offensive?
The source reiterates the presence of this key enemy formation. It states that the enemy's 505 military division, the Gibrehel, had been stationed at the North-Eastern Sahel Front. So despite the engagements during the third offensive period, this major enemy unit remained positioned along that extensive coastal line.
And the source provides details about the size and strength of this 505 division.
Yes, it describes this specific unit as comprising 2 infantry and 2 mechanized brigades. Furthermore, it notes that these brigades were heavily armed. And to emphasize its overall power, the source adds, there are also other backup forces along with this hugely armed unit. So it sounds like a very substantial and well-equipped force positioned right there at the NSF.
However, despite its initial strength, the source also describes the condition of this 505 division before the next major offensive was launched. What state were they actually in, according to this account?
Yeah, the source paints a picture of a unit that had been significantly degraded by the fighting up to that point. It states that the 505 division was heavily weakened and all its members were frustrated.
Frustrated? Why? Does it say?
The source attributes this weakened and frustrated state directly to subsequent leases in 3 offensives. This implies that the previous engagements, including those during the period described as the third offensive, which involved those coastal movements and the push towards Gori Tewagen, had taken a really severe toll on the personnel and the morale of this particular division, according to this account.
So a major enemy unit intended to be a powerhouse, is described here as weakened and frustrated due to prior defeats. Despite this, what was the resolve of the Derg regime, as presented in the source? Did this affect their plans?
Well, the source really contrasts the state of the forces on the ground with the, well, unwavering determination of the leadership back in Addis Ababa. It states that despite the losses and the weakened state of some units, the Derg regime decided to continue the war relentlessly.
Really?
Yes. Their objective, as articulated in the source, was set out to destroy Eritrean revolution once and forever, no matter what it takes, through engaging the EPLF forces in ceaseless battles. This really conveys a perspective of absolute commitment from the enemy leadership, irrespective of the cost or the condition of their troops on the front lines.
And this relentless determination, even with apparently weakened forces, directly led to another major military push.
Yes. The source explains that following the setbacks in the previous offensives, the enemy didn't give up. Instead, they undertook a period of preparation and reorganization specifically aimed at launching yet another attack.
How long did this preparation phase last before the fourth offensive kicked off?
According to the source, this period of preparation and reorganization lasted for a 1.5 month, about 6 weeks.
And this culminated in the launch of the fourth offensive.
Precisely. The source states that the enemy launched this fourth offensive in April 1979, following that 6-week preparation period.
What was the enemy's strategy for this fourth offensive, as described in the source? What were they trying to achieve this time?
The source says their tactic had been to make use of all available weaponry and deploy a number of soldiers as much as possible so as to penetrate the EPLF's stronghold. So it sounds like a strategy relying pretty much on overwhelming force, using every weapon they had and throwing large numbers of soldiers at the EPLF's fortified positions, just aiming to break through by sheer weight of attack.
But the source also highlights a significant challenge the enemy faced in actually executing this strategy, right? Something inherent to the area.
Yes, the terrain. Again, the terrain was a major obstacle, according to this account. The source explicitly points out that the mountainous areas and terrains were not favorable for the enemy.
How did this unfavorable mountainous terrain impact their ability to apply their chosen tactic of overwhelming force?
Well, the source explains that because of the difficulty presented by the terrain, the enemy had not been in the position to launch an attack on the two wings of the front. This implies that while they might have wanted to apply pressure everywhere, the mountains limited their ability to effectively attack both flanks of the EPLF's line simultaneously, maybe forcing them to concentrate their efforts in more geographically accessible areas or choke points.
And where the enemy could attack with their massed forces, how effective was the EPLF's defense, according to this source?
The source states pretty definitively that all attempts of penetration faced EPLF strong resistance. So despite the enemy's use of, all available weaponry and large numbers of soldiers, the EPLF forces held their ground and prevented the enemy from breaking through their stronghold positions.
Were there specific counteractions or victories for the EPLF during this heavy battle that the source details? Did they push back?
Yes. The source describes the EPLF not just holding their ground, but actively pushing the enemy back in certain specific areas. It specifies two notable outcomes from this period. The EPLF, it says, totally discarded the enemy from Debremen and El Sada.
Totally discarded. That sounds pretty definitive, like completely driven out of those locations.
Exactly. Pushed out entirely, according to this account. And the source details another successful EPLF counterattack during this offensive that cleared the enemy from Korora-Shigalet route.
Clearing a route is strategically important. So, the EPLF was not just defensive, but managed some significant localized offensives themselves. What was the overall outcome of the fourth offensive, then, as presented in this document?
Well, the source summarizes the conclusion of this major enemy push in pretty stark terms. It states, the enemy experienced heavy lose in the fourth offensive and had been slammed hard, unable to continue its advance.
Slammed hard. That phrase really conveys the intensity of the defeat, doesn't it? According to the source, anyway.
It does. It leaves very little ambiguity about the outcome from the perspective of this document. The fourth offensive, despite the enemy's preparations and commitment of forces, resulted in heavy losses and a complete failure to advance. And it's worth noting, the source does mention that during the same general period as the fourth offensive on the main front, the enemy also launched a heavy attack specifically targeting the Nakfa front.
Against the permanent stronghold they'd established earlier.
Yes. The source says this attack on Nakfa was also accompanied by ceaseless aerial bombardments and was aimed to penetrate EPLF's front line, particularly at the right wing of Nakfa front. So while the main thrust of the Fourth Offensive might have been elsewhere, significant pressure was simultaneously maintained on that critical Nakfa stronghold.
Okay, so another major enemy offensive repelled, according to this source's account. But demonstrating that relentless resolve you mentioned earlier, the story doesn't end there, does it? The source describes yet another significant enemy push the Fifth Offensive.
That's correct. Following the significant defeat of the Fourth Offensive, the enemy, again, required time to regroup and prepare for their next attempt.
How long was the preparation and recovery period this time, before the Fifth Offensive?
Well, the source indicates it was a more substantial period this time around, a 3 months of preparation and recovery period before they launched the Fifth Offensive.
3 months. Why was a longer recovery period needed after the Fourth Offensive compared to the, 1.5 months after the earlier defeats?
The source provides a pretty clear reason for that. It states, most of its army had been irrecoverably beaten from the First through the Fourth Offensives.
Irrecoverably beaten.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, this suggests that the cumulative toll of the preceding 4 offensives, particularly the heavy losses sustained in the Fourth, had severely degraded the enemy forces, necessitating a much longer time to reconstitute and prepare for another major operation.
And did they bring in reinforcements during this longer recovery period to make up for those losses? Yes, and on a very significant scale, according to the source. It states that the enemy mobilized an additional of 20,000 infantry and other supporting units.
20,000 additional infantry plus support units. That's a massive injection of manpower and resources to try and overcome the previous setbacks.
It is indeed a substantial reinforcement described by the source. And the document, in a brief and perhaps, telling sentence right there, adds that even with this significant buildup, and this also ended with the defeat of the enemy.
Giving away the ending a bit. But, okay, let's get the details as the source presents them. When did this heavily reinforced Fifth Offensive begin?
The source states that the Fifth Offensive commenced on July 13, 1979.
And where did it start? Was it along the established NSF or Nakfa fronts or somewhere else?
The source actually mentions a specific location for the start of this offensive, Mednichak. And it describes Mednichak as a newly established front for this particular offensive, suggesting the enemy might have opened a new axis of attack rather than just pounding the old established ones again.
Interesting. How long did this significant Fifth Offensive last?
The source provides the end date as July 26, 1979. So that means the intense fighting of this offensive continued for a duration of 11 days.
11 days. What were the initial results of the attacks on the main battle lines described in the source? How did they fare?
Well, according to the source, the initial assaults were unsuccessful for the attacking forces. It states quite clearly, none of the attacks launched in the 2 front lines had been in favor of the enemy. Furthermore, attempts by the enemy to gain ground by opening what the source calls a third front were also, quote, in vain. So their main pushes on existing lines and their attempt to open a new front failed to yield results early on.
And the EPLF wasn't caught off guard by attacks from unexpected directions either during this offensive, according to the source. They were ready for that.
No, it seems not. The source again highlights the EPLF's strategic anticipation. It says that as the EPLF expected the enemy would come in other directions, they didn't just sit and wait on their established lines. They had apparently foreseen that the enemy, after previous failures, might try alternative approaches.
And how did they counter this potential multi-directional approach? What did they do?
Well, the EPLF proactively deployed units to conduct ambushes in a bid to block enemy forces, who might try to come from those other directions. This really shows they were actively preparing for flanking maneuvers or attacks away from the primary axis.
The source mentions a specific EPLF unit, Brigade 44, as being heavily engaged during this period. Where were they positioned and what were they doing?
Yes, the source specifically notes that Brigade 44 took a position in the mountainous terrains of Agré, and this brigade was involved in very intense combat, described as being engaged in fierce battle for 4 days. This engagement was likely part of dealing with the enemy's attempts to advance from multiple directions, or perhaps via difficult terrain, just as the EPLF had anticipated.
Okay, so while fierce fighting was ongoing on the main lines and in these blocking positions, the source describes a separate critical action by another EPLF unit that appears to have had a pretty devastating impact on the entire enemy offensive. What was that?
Ah, yes. This is arguably the most impactful detail from this offensive described in the source, and this is where it gets really interesting. Simultaneously with the ongoing battles, another EPLF unit executed a pre-planned attack targeting the enemy's command line.
A direct, targeted strike right against the enemy's central nervous system for the offensive.
Exactly. And the source describes this action as a surprise attack on that command structure.
What was the immediate and critical impact of this surprise attack on the enemy command line, as detailed in the source?
Well, the consequences were presented as immediate and devastating for the enemy forces during this crucial offensive. The source states unequivocally that commander of the front, Colonel Kasa Gebremariam, and other army commanders were killed in this attack.
Killing the commanding officer of the entire front and other senior leaders right in the middle of the battle. That would cause chaos.
It did, according to the source. The consequence described is profound. Thus, the enemy was in commotion and with no leadership. With their top commanders eliminated in a surprise strike, the enemy forces were left confused, disorganized, and effectively decapitated in terms of command and control right during the height of the offensive.
Wow. Was this attack on the command post the only EPLF action happening at that precise moment? Or was it coordinated?
No, the source points out that this was not an isolated event. It notes that, parallel to the attack carried out on the command post, the EPLF also launched a counterattack in the main front line.
So they hit the leadership and simultaneously pushed hard on the main body of troops who were now leaderless. What was the combined effect of eliminating the command and launching that parallel counterattack?
The source describes the result of this coordinated action quite plainly. The enemy was scattered everywhere. Without leadership and facing renewed pressure on their main line, their forces apparently broke formation and dispersed in disarray.
And what was the ultimate conclusion of this 11-day fifth offensive, characterized by massed troops, new fronts, flanking attempts, and that absolutely critical command strike?
Well, like the offensives before it described in the source, the fifth offensive was also concluded with EPLF's victory.
And the cost to the enemy in terms of casualties during this specific offensive, does the source report a number?
It does. The source provides a specific and frankly staggering number for the enemy's losses in this single offensive. It states the fifth offensive ended by burdening the enemy with a causality of nearly 13,000 of its troops.
13,000 casualties in just 11 days. That's a tremendous loss of manpower described for that short period.
It really is, yeah. A huge cost attributed to that offensive in this account.
Okay. Looking back across the description of the third, fourth, and fifth offensives, as presented in this particular source, what overall pattern seems to emerge from this account of these intense engagements?
Well, based solely on the narrative provided by this document that we've looked at today, you see a very clear and recurring pattern emerge. You have these determined, often large-scale enemy offensives, sometimes involving significant reinforcements like that 20,000, or new tactical approaches like diversionary maneuvers or opening new fronts.
Right.
However, these offensives, as described here, are consistently met with strategic EPLF responses. These involve tactical withdrawals to stronger positions, pre-planned anticipation of enemy movements, like those coastal or flanking approaches, agile repositioning, and crucial, often very timely, counterattacks like the one at Nakfa, or the coordinated one during the fifth offensive.
And
the result, as described here, is that these engagements repeatedly result in significant enemy losses and the failure of the enemy to achieve their stated objectives of penetrating or destroying the EPLF's positions. The source consistently paints a picture of successive, costly setbacks for the attacking forces against what it portrays as a resilient and strategically adaptive defense.
This source certainly provides a very focused and specific account of these intense military engagements and their outcomes, clearly from a particular viewpoint. We've covered a considerable amount of ground in this deep dive today, tracing the strategic withdrawals and the formation of that massive North-Eastern Sahel Front, detailing the critical defense and decisive counterattack that secured the gates of Nakfa, and exploring the descriptions of the third, fourth, and fifth enemy offensives and their consistent defeat as told by this document.
It's been a deep dive specifically into a challenging and critical period of the conflict as documented in this particular source material, really highlighting specific battles and strategic shifts described within it.
And just a reminder for everyone listening, this was part 2 of a 3-part series dedicated to exploring this single source material in depth.
That's right. The story as told by this document is certainly not yet complete. There are further developments, challenges, and outcomes described that we will delve into in part 3.
So, as we wrap up this part, here's something for you to consider, based only on the specific details presented in this source material that we've discussed today. Given the repeated descriptions of heavy enemy losses and failed objectives across these third, fourth, and fifth offensives, What specific elements detailed in the source, perhaps related to the challenging mountainous terrain the enemy faced? Maybe specific EPLF tactics, like those pre-planned ambushes in anticipated flanking areas, or the strategically timed counterattacks, or even the described devastating impact of that command line strike during the Fifth Offensive, what seems to be the most significant factor, according to this source, in consistently shaping the outcomes described here.
Yeah, it's definitely worth contemplating those specific details drawn directly from the source to discern what stands out to you as contributing most significantly to the narrative of defense and successful resistance presented in this particular document. We'll pick it up again in part 3.